Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place to be spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. This is the audio version of the past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors, Michael Stoker, Seth Walsh Blackmore, Vivian Lay, Catherine Solkowski, Rebecca DeFabio, Kitan Patel, and Clay Smith. Okay, let's go straight to the fourth article, titled Hypothermia and Mortality Among Children in the Emergency Department, out of the journal Pediatrics. Now, we know, of course, that fevers in young children, particularly very young children, infants, is, bad. It's a sign of disease. However, hypothermia, while we certainly have a sort of negative connotation to it, and we think that it is likely associated with badness, it's less clear. In the context of trauma, hypothermia is clearly associated with worse outcomes. However, for the rest of the emergency department, for the rest of a pediatric emergency department, all comers to the ED, the associations are not very well, sort of elucidated. So these authors wanted to look at just that, all comers to pediatric emergency departments, and see what is the in-hospital outcomes of these patients. So this was a large multi-center retrospective trial using PCARN data for 5.3 million pediatric emergency department visits. They chose 36 degrees Celsius as the limit to be considered hypothermic. There is no set specific definition, but that's the one they chose, and I think that is quite reasonable. This represented 3% of their cohort, about 160,000 pediatric emergency department visits. And what they saw was that being hypothermic independently predicted a 20 times greater odds of death in these children. So an odds ratio of around 20, even after multivariate regression. And we see that these patients are hugely overrepresented in this sort of, high mortality cohort because 39% of mortalities presented with hypothermia. Now, if you exclude the patients that were likely perimortem when they presented, if you exclude patients that died in the emergency department, you still get an odds ratio of 10, which is still quite high. The greatest risk was in small infants, those aged less than 90 days old. If you were a very low acuity presentation to the emergency department, then in that case, it was much less worrisome, but still so. An odds ratio of 3.6, which is much less than 10, much less than 20, but still an abnormality. If you're more aggressive with what you consider hypothermia, looking at a temperature less than 35 degrees Celsius, then the odds ratio was 150. But I suspect a lot of those patients came in, perimortem. Now, this is interesting data, and it should make you look at patients who are hypothermic a little bit more skeptically. However, this was only patients presenting to children's hospitals in the emergency department, and the mode of the temperature assessment was not reported. So if your kid's sick, thus you're not doing a full proper temperature, maybe you're doing a forehead, a tympanic membrane, something like that, maybe we're getting not very good numbers on some of these children. And it could not necessarily be that the hypothermia is, it's definitely not what's making them sick, but it's just that very sick children could tend to be hypothermic. And that maybe this isn't going to be a very useful sign because the child otherwise looks very ill. Regardless, it was still associated with mortality. Recall that we've actually covered things like this before. We covered an article a while ago that looked at children who were presenting with incidental hypothermia at a routine outpatient visit, and they saw that it was not associated with any serious infections. And so not every child that has some degree of hypothermia is necessarily going to be super high risk, but this should still be a sign that you take seriously. Children presenting with hypothermia with a good, reliable temperature measurement should be, well looked after. So in a spoonful, pediatric patients with hypothermia at emergency department presentation, well, this was strongly associated with in-hospital mortality. And then the fifth article titled Emergency Medical Services Equipment Use in the Emergency Department and Time to Care for Those with Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest out of the Annals of Emergency Medicine. This is a fun study. I like to see this. I don't know why this hasn't been looked at before or more thoroughly. We already know that for every minute that you delay for shocking your patient, mortality increases by about 10%. So if you've got an out of hospital cardiac arrest and they're shockable, you want to shock them as soon as possible. So one of the most complicated parts of an OCA is when they actually get to the hospital, because then things get a little bit complicated, right? It's not just the EMS service then that's running, ACLS. Now they've got to hand that over to the hospital team, and this can get confusing. You've got a patient on their gurney, have to get it onto our gurney. What about their monitors? We want them on our monitors. Things can get a little bit complicated. So what this study was, this was a single center retrospective study where they reviewed videos of their trauma bays when patients present from the out of hospital cardiac arrest and show up in the emergency room. And so they can watch the videos, listen to the audio, look at all the vital signs and everything, and see how long it takes for the patient to get the first rhythm analysis and the first shock. And they divided these patients on whether or not that first analysis and shock was done using the EMS equipment, so the monitor, defibrillator, and pads, or using the emergency department equipment. So they called this the EMS group and the ED group. And what they found was a shockingly large difference. If you used the EMS equipment, then the analysis time and the first shock time were 2 minutes earlier, which is actually, that's huge. That's a big difference. 2 minutes is a way bigger difference than I would have thought that we would see. And as a result of this, perhaps due to this 2-minute delay, there were more defibrillations in the EMS group, 45% versus 27%, with numerically improved survival to discharge, 8% versus 1%, though not statistically significant. Now, there are many explanations why this could be the case that could answer the questions of why there's such a big difference. Was it prioritized in certain circumstances? We don't know what the emergency department physician was actually thinking at the time because we just have these videos. Was the patient left on the EMS equipment so that they would get a faster time to analysis because they were told there was going to be a shockable rhythm or that there were previous shocks? Perhaps this was prioritized in certain circumstances when they knew that the patient was more likely to have a shockable rhythm. And in other cases, that this wasn't prioritized necessarily as much. And this was the reason for the delay in doing an analysis and that they just had them put over onto the hospital's equipment. Now, this whole concept seems a little bit foreign to me because where I work, it takes seconds to switch them over from the EMS equipment to our equipment because we don't have to change the pads or anything like that. All you have to do is unplug their stuff and plug in our stuff. The monitors and everything I don't really care about so much during an arrest as long as I can do the rhythm analysis. I know that they're not really going to have a heart rate, they're not going to have a blood pressure, all that stuff, fine, it's not a priority. All we really need are those pads hooked off from their monitor to our monitor to see if we can give a shock or not when it's appropriate. So in that circumstance, I don't have to change any pads or anything. I think my switchovers, at least where I practice, is probably a lot faster than this. But all the same, this is a very interesting question. Certainly for some circumstances, especially if people can't do that and they have to switch over all of this equipment from the EMS to the hospital. The authors are very clear throughout their paper that this is just a sort of exploratory analysis and that is heavily probably influenced by, indication and selection bias. All the same, this is a very interesting study and I really appreciate the methods. I think this is very interesting that they got to do video analysis for this kind of thing. I love this. In Spoonful, these authors found an association between the use of EMS equipment for analysis and defibrillation of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients and improved metrics, as well as a hint towards better patient outcomes. Okay, so that's the 5 articles from this week. What did we talk about? Then from the 4th article, hypothermia in patients when they present to a pediatric emergency department has a significant odds ratio for mortality in the hospital. And then from the 5th article, in this retrospective video review trial, the use of EMS equipment during cardiac arrest led to faster rhythm assessment and shock times by more than 2 minutes. Now, if you were hearing this right now, then you were not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles from this past week. What were those articles about that you missed? Well, one was looking at whole blood use in a HEMS unit. Another was a review of how to reverse anticoagulants. And then lastly, TXA given routinely perioperatively, does it decrease transfusions? Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to keep up the easy way through spoon feeding.